Today we're going to be watching a video about people who don't know when to give up. You see, in the late 1980s in the United States, creation science had made it into a number of schools. The Supreme Court found a problem with this and banned it. At the time, some creation science people were writing a book called Of Pandas and People. They switched the wording around to make it about intelligent design, their new buzzword for creation science. In the mid-2000s, this was once again banned, and they did not give up. In fact, they run a number of websites where they try to press their case in a non-scientific way. For example, they run a website called Evolution News. Evolution News takes any developments about evolutionary theory and just tries to tear them apart. They also run a site called Mind Matters, which is about artificial intelligence. Naturally, they make the link between artificial intelligence and intelligent design. Lately, they've been on Rogan and other places trying to press their case. Today, they're being watched by, I guess, Daily Dose of Wisdom. So we're going to watch Daily Dose of Wisdom, watching them, and get really meta with this. Let's see where it goes.
When Isaac Newton developed his wonderful law of gravity, he was asked, what the heck is gravity? And he said, hypothesis non fingo.
Yes.
I feign no hypothesis.
He had no mechanism.
He didn't have a mechanism. What's the mechanism for the Big Bang?
Nobody knows.
What's the mechanism for radioactive decay?
Well, obviously, since we don't have the answers, you can just say God did it. That's easy. Now we've solved the problem and don't have to think about it anymore. Isn't that right, guys?
I don't know. So there's lots of things that happen. People don't know what the mechanism is, but we see patterns and we can deduce explanations from the patterns.
Okay. I'm going to quote you.
But interestingly enough, these intelligent design people don't have explanations. All they have is criticisms. And there's nothing wrong with having criticisms. But in science, if you're going to have a criticism, especially one of something so important as evolution, you're going to need an explanation for why this is the case. If you are saying that evolution can't work, therefore it must be an intelligent designer, you're going to have to answer two other questions. First of all, how did the intelligent designer do the designs? How did they do that? Secondly, who is this intelligent designer? If you can't answer those questions, you're really not getting anywhere with your incredible, amazing hypothesis.
And I begin by quoting someone you quote. This is more Behe here. Biochemist Franklin Harold, in his 2001 book, The Way of the Cell, quote, "We should reject as a matter of principle the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity, but we must concede that there are presently no detailed accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful explanations," close quote.
Now, of course, before we proceed, I must point out that these people lie for a living, so this quote was definitely taken out of context. This is called cherry picking. The reason why you cherry pick something is you pick a quote that sounds reasonable for your side. It sounds good for your side. It may not make your case for you, but it does some heavy lifting towards getting there. I suspect if you were to ask Franklin Harold what he thinks of the intelligent design people, he would say they are wrong. I mean, we're talking about a whole book here, presumably on evolution and how it works. And I suspect that this is on a very, very small, like, micro level, a very tiny level of evolutionary theory here. And maybe it's an area where we don't have great explanations, or didn't back then whenever this was written, and since then we've found some. However, they do this all the time. They point out this very, very small area and say, look, this proves our case. Well, no, it doesn't. Us not having a solid explanation for something does not, in fact, mean that you can just insert your own in there. You have to have evidence for your assertion. And with intelligent design, which is creationism, we see none.
And Michael says, well, to begin with, that's quite a breathtaking concession, and congratulations, the science has moved along enough to recognize the limits to Darwin. And then...
That is not what happened there. What happened there is the intelligent design people popped up and said that there is this problem, and you guys can't solve it, so therefore it must be God. And this person is saying, no, I think you're jumping the gun a bit on that, actually.
Michael continues, Harold never spells out his reasoning, that is to say, why we should reject intelligent design in principle, but I think the principle probably boils down to this. Design appears to point strongly beyond nature. All three of us are down for, everybody's down for that. It has philosophical and theological implications because some think that science should avoid a theory that points so strongly beyond nature They want to rule out intelligent design from the start, close quote.
One good reason to rule out intelligent design from the start is that it's not science. We are talking about scientific matters. You can have your philosophy, you can have your theology, but that has no place in science. Science is not about having a philosophy or a theology. Science is about having evidence. And again, there is no evidence for intelligent design, which is another reason you can reject it offhand. Essentially, what the other person was saying is, there is no evidence for intelligent design. We may not yet have explanations for how certain things work, but we have a pretty good idea of how things work. The intelligent design people, they don't have that much. They just have criticisms of evolutionary theory. And whether their criticisms are good or not is beyond the point. You need more than criticisms to make your case for why things work the way you say they do. We do not see evidence of design. We see evidence of things we don't know yet. We've only just begun thinking about these things. Evolutionary science has been a thing for almost 200 years in its current form, in its modern form. I mean, if you want to get technical, I guess you could say Darwin was the start, but he is far from anything resembling the evolution Jesus. I guess you could say in its modern form, the study of evolution began really with DNA. So, very recent things. You wouldn't expect to have solved the whole of evolutionary theory in about 200 years. We're talking about stuff that took 3 billion years, maybe more than that, to actually happen over time. You're not going to solve the whole thing in 200 years, and that does not give room for you to just throw God in there.
Quote. This is the question of drawing lines. And I pose the question to Michael Behe, what the heck is wrong with that? We just say, science goes as far as it goes with our 5 senses and what we can reason therefrom. And when it hits a dead end, it says, dead end. Okay, well, you haven't got it. Radioactive decay, gravity, don't know. Go ahead. So what's wrong with drawing these very sharp lines? Why do you want to include intelligent design in the scientific enterprise?
See, I disagree with the way that question was framed. They're only dead ends until you figure out ways to explain them. Yes, certain things remain unexplained, but we have pretty good ideas and pretty good ideas of how to test these things. And we have to work on it. It has to be worked on. These intelligent design creationists, they're not actually working on anything. They're just spitballing. They just have ideas of a designer who was God. And God did it. That's their explanation. That's not much of an explanation. You need a real explanation for these things. You gotta try to find actual evidence for how things happened. They have none of that. They just have, well, we can't explain this yet, so God did it. That's not how it works.
Well, for a couple reasons. First, if scientists claimed that they did not know how life developed, that would be good with me. That would be a step in the right direction because they...
Well, I mean, we have a pretty good idea of how life developed in some regards because we are alive. We can sort of observe how life works. We can observe the constituents through which life is made. And not only that, we can observe them throughout the cosmos. I mean, like things like amino acids. And beyond that, I mean, water and carbon. We know the basic constituents of life, so it seems pretty obvious that those had to come together somehow. Now, you could imagine the conditions on the early Earth that would have led to the first life forming, assuming it did form on Earth and not somewhere else. And if you can go that far, you've already gone pretty far towards answering the question. It's not just, well, guess we'll never know, if you have pretty good, starting points for these things. And these people always stick on this stuff. Origin of life research is a very important field, and they're doing good work and getting closer all the time. Just because we don't have for sure the information doesn't mean the information isn't out there. And I suspect once scientists have perfectly mimicked the conditions of the early Earth and essentially generated new life, these people will still have complaints.
They don't. Unfortunately, people pretend that they do. On the other hand, we can tell, we conclude design, we infer design from physical evidence. It's not from some, vision or anything that people have. If you look at a mousetrap, you can tell it was designed, and you can tell because you see how the parts are arranged, what the relationship of the parts with respect to each other to perform a function.
See, this is the watchmaker analogy. The idea is this. You're walking through a field, and in this field you find a watch. Are you going to be assuming that the watch grew in the field, or are you going to assume that somebody made it? And the answer is obviously we're going to assume somebody made it. But the reason is we know how watches are made. We know it's a human process. Likewise with the mousetrap. When it comes to cells, for example, we do not see that. We do not see that cells were created by somebody else. We do not know a process by which another person, another being, I guess you could say, a god, if you will, created cells. We don't see that. Instead, we see evolution happening. We see a large evolutionary history behind the creation of cells, even if we can't explain the specific way cells formed.
When you look at an outboard motor on a boat, you see the same thing. You see a purposeful arrangement of parts. Now we see that in the machinery of the cell.
No, we don't, and this argument has been disproven over and over again. In fact, this was disproven in court in Kitzmiller versus Dover, the case that got intelligent design banned from U.S. schools. In Kitzmiller versus Dover, they used an example that I believe was from Of Pandas of People, which is the bacterial flagellar motor. Say that 3 times fast. The bacterial flagellar motor, they said that you couldn't really reduce it in any way without making it non-functional. But in fact, scientists showed that if you reduce certain parts of it, the parts they said were irreducible, it still had a function. So they have been proven wrong on this point over and over, and yet they insist that they are still correct.
We see outboard motors in the cell. We see trucks in the cell, and so on.
But your life would be so much easier if at the end of your article you said,
less fun.
You said, if you would like to pursue this further, go to the Department of Philosophy. Go to the Department of Theology. Here the science ends.
I say that after we conclude design. I do not infer to God. And as I write, some people have approached me and said, yeah, I'm with you. I think it's intelligent, but I think it's, space aliens have visited us.
Fred Hoyle's explanation.
Exactly.
Go ahead, John.
The big problem there is if space aliens did create us, you would have to ask, well, what created them? Now, there is a video that Daily Dose of Wisdom himself did where he's talking about a documentary called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, which is by Ben Stein, a crazy right-wing economist who was interviewing, supposedly, Richard Dawkins about intelligent design. And in that, Dawkins kind of spitballed a bit and was like, well, I suppose it could be that humanity was designed by aliens. It's unlikely, but it's certainly possible. And they just ran with it and said, well, what, Dawkins believes in intelligent design by aliens? Well, no, he doesn't. He just said it's a possibility. And yes, it is a possibility, but if aliens did, in fact, create humanity, those aliens themselves would have arisen through natural processes, at least very similar to what we have on Earth, which is evolution, stuff like that. So keep that in mind.
I think the basic question here is, there are several and they're very important, is what is an explanation? That's a crucial question. And
now we're getting into some like Jordan Peterson postmodernism, like, well, in order to answer the question of is there a God, you have to first answer what the meaning of is, and there, and a, and even God. What do these mean? If you're gonna ask the question, you have to understand what each word means, and that they might mean very different things to each person.
Michael cited Newton, hypothesi non fingo. His gravity, when I was taught in school, I thought the law of gravity explained gravity.
This guy is a mathematician, and for some reason, despite being a mathematician, he thinks he's qualified to speak on everything under the sun. There is something called Nobel syndrome, or Nobel's disease, which is, I don't know if this guy has one, but people who have won Nobel Prizes very often speak outside of their fields of expertise and think of themselves as generalized experts, and of course they're not, so they're very frequently wrong. They get big egos and become quite arrogant and think they know more than they know. You can see the same thing happening with engineers. I mean, there is another thing, Salem hypothesis, which suggests that engineers are a lot more likely to be young Earth creationists because if you're an engineer, you might be naturally prone to seeing design like human design in everything.
And I was an adult before I discovered it explains no such thing. So that even a scientific explanation within its own terms is rarely full. It's almost never full. That's the first thing.
And so you can just put God in there. Why not?
Secondly, we admit at all kinds of levels explanations in terms of agent, like if we want a complete description of the motor car. Now, your earlier question to my...
Well, that's because we know the agent. We know the process. We have done that ourselves. You can have an agent if the agent sprang about through evolution by natural selection. We are the agents in that case. We know how we got here. Evolution by natural selection after a few billion years of evolution. We know how we sprang about. We know who we are. We know how we design things. In intelligent design, these are the big missing answers, which is, how did the designer do these designs, and who is the designer? Now, we all know that the designer for these people is God. That is the designer. But they can't say the quiet part out loud. They can only infer to a designer. They can only infer to God, because if they say God, well, they know they're not going to be taken seriously. And in fact, no scientist takes them seriously anyway.
Michael, could God have done this? There is a sense in which God can do things any way he likes. But the issue is, how does...
I agree with Daily Dose here. Your friendly reminder to subscribe. Please subscribe, like this video, and comment, because it helps with the algorithms. And we do want to see this stuff get as far as possible, because I respond to these people all the time because I hate them. So please help this get further and do your part, and we can all dab on intelligent design creationists together as a family. You are my family now. I have adopted you. Congratulations, you are my son, daughter, or non-binary child.
God do it? And secondly, is his activity detectable scientifically? Now, I'm putting those words together very carefully. Not is his...
Notice how uncomfortable the other two there look, because they are smart enough to not say the quiet part out loud. They're smart enough to not say the big G word. They know that if they say the big G word, they are venturing outside of scientific territory, so they don't want to say it. They want to leave some ambiguity for who this designer is. But our mathematician friend over here apparently missed that memo.
Involvement detectable, but is it detectable in terms of science? In other words, if you set up your definition of science as restricted to the five senses,
Yes.
so that you're not, and here comes the principle, the Socratic principle, that is often violated, that the late Antony Flew saw, that when he came to conclude that there was an intelligent designer behind the universe on the basis of DNA, and they said, oh, but you can't do that. He said, I follow the evidence where it leads. And this is the clash.
Well, nobody said to Antony Flew, you can't do that. In fact, the arguments over that were very different. If you didn't know, Antony Flew was an atheist philosopher. Apparently, he was a pretty famous one, although you mostly hear about him these days because of the deist thing. So Antony Flew had dementia. This is a fact. We know this for a fact. And while Antony Flew had dementia, while he was in decline, a Christian philosopher convinced him, using certain arguments, that a God must exist. Now you might think, okay, so Antony Flew became a Christian. No, Antony Flew became a deist. A deist is somebody who believes that a God created the universe and then just left, which in my opinion is a lot better of an explanation than the, normal sort of theistic personal God, for a number of reasons. I mean, I've said this a lot, and I'll say it a lot more. For me, what makes me an atheist more than anything else is the fact that the universe works how you would expect it to if there were no God. The deist God offends me a lot less than the theistic personal God, because the deist God doesn't intervene in the universe. He created it and bounced, set off the Big Bang, and then was just like, okay, my work here is done. See you later, losers. And I can respect that a whole lot more, because we don't see interference in the natural universe from anything outside of it. We just see natural laws at work. So, Antony Flew, his perspective, even if it was gotten to by dementia, doesn't really bother me. Now, I must say in fairness, we cannot say for sure whether it was dementia that caused Antony Flew to reach his conclusion, or whether he was genuinely convinced before dementia got that bad. Maybe he'd been thinking about it for a while and his thinking evolved. It happens sometimes. But Antony Flew is not the be-all, end-all of atheism, just like Darwin is not the be-all, end-all of evolution. Now, that's one thing. Another thing I have to point out here is the definition of science as being what is perceptible with the five senses. Now, I don't find that to be an offensive definition, but I do find it to be a wrong one. For me, what science is about the natural world and determining how the natural world works. If you're determining how the natural world works, you're going to determine it based on nature itself. You're not going to try to look outside of the natural world for explanations. You're not going to see a mystery and go, Well, this mystery is too much for us. It must be God. Some things may remain forever unsolved. If we're talking about what is gravity, we have ideas, but that's going to be a really hard question to solve without certain technologies that we're probably very far away from. If we're talking about what caused the Big Bang, we have pretty good ideas of that. But again, what came before the Big Bang, if anything came before it, is a question that may be locked off from us forever and sealed off from us forever. It may not be. We don't know. But just because a question may be unanswerable does not give you the right to insert your own answer in there. It's perfectly fine to say, I don't know. We don't know. Yes, certainly. The idea that God created the universe is an idea. And you can say that. You can say, well, I think God created the universe. Sure, fine, whatever. The problem is when you try to insert that into science and say, not only do I think God created the universe, I think that to the exclusion of all other ideas, and I think that's science, because it's not.
That arises. You can either say, well, science has come to an end. It cannot answer this question. There are very few people want to say that. Or you say, science is limited. We must open the field to other kinds of questions, like the why questions of purpose, like teleology and all this kind of thing. And
man, this stuff is just depressing. Look at this guy's face. Look at how self-satisfied he is. Look at just like, I mean, you can see in his face just everything that like bothers me about these intelligent design people. They're so self-satisfied with like their ideas, which is like silly. I am not self-satisfied. I have pretty good ideas, but you will never see the level of self-satisfaction on my face you see on that guy's face. And in fact, you know, science is a special thing. Science is, in my opinion, the only thing humans really have to figure things out. Everything else is pretty speculative, like philosophy and theology. It's all very speculative. Science is the only thing, the only route to determining real truth in this universe, the real ways things for sure work. And by trying to insert their, you know, sort of like philosophical, theological stuff in there, they're trying to devalue science. For them, science is, in a bizarre sense, as sacred as it is to me. And that's why they want to insert their religion in there. They think inserting their religion into science is going to give them a kind of validation they can't possibly get without science. And they are right. And that's why we should never let them have it.
the underlying mistake that we're forced to think is that science and rationality are coextensive when they're not.
And also that there...
That is to say, science does not cover the full field of rationality.
No, history is a rational discipline.
I don't think anybody is saying that. What we are saying is that science is the only method of determining truth. Philosophy doesn't do that. Theology doesn't do that. They can get the drop on truth, but they can't determine it. They have no ways to determine truth.
And
so's
there are
philosophy.
other kinds of sciences, and this is what my PhD was about. There's historical
historical
scientific reasoning, which is all about abduction, inferring back to causal, to explain causal origins. Imagine that you walk into the British Museum and you look at the Rosetta Stone, and someone says, "Well, how did those inscriptions come about?" If the archaeologist is governed by a principle that you alluded to indirectly, it's called methodological naturalism. We may only infer materialistic causes, whatever the evidence. The scientist would miss the obvious explanation. This was produced by scribes.
Right.
You know, this is a good example of equivocation. He's saying that a hard materialist viewpoint prevents you from recognizing things like humanity's involvement in technologies, archaeologically speaking. Like if you're looking at, let's say you're digging up a site and you find an aqueduct, like a buried aqueduct that it was in use a long time ago, that if you are a materialist, you have to assume that nature made that. That is not the case. That has never been the case. And by saying that, by implying that, he's sort of misleading the viewer about what materialism actually is. So these people, man, it's really maddening to watch them go at it, because no matter how many times you correct them on these things, they just continue spouting the same ideas over and over. I mean, Again, irreducible complexity was proven wrong in a court in 2005, Kitzmiller versus Dover. You can look it up yourself. There is a great documentary by PBS called Intelligent Design on Trial about exactly that. And yet they're still going with the same examples. No, the hard materialist viewpoint is, well, I mean, first of all, I think he's explaining materialism in a very odd way, first of all. But I think the hard materialist viewpoint does not exclude the involvement of humanity when it is, in fact, human stuff we're searching for. We're searching for the remnants of human technology and humanity in archaeology in a lot of cases. And the materialist viewpoint does not in any way go against that. It's part of the search.
Intelligent agents. There are distinctive indicators of the activity of intelligence, and therefore that allows us to infer.
It's language.
There was one of the early pioneers in the information.
And of course, we do not see language in, for example, DNA. We do describe the features of DNA with 4 letters, A, G, C, T, I think. Hopefully I'm not wrong on that. That'll be a big egg in my face. But we do describe them using letters, and these letters together form a sort of like tapestry. They form like a big, quilt of just information. Information that makes things and does things. And that is not exactly the same as human language. We describe it in similar terms, but it's not the same thing. It is a collection of information gained over a long period of time through naturalistic processes. It is not the same thing as somebody getting together with like other people, inventing an alphabet, and then making like writings out of it based on a language. It's not the same thing at all. Now, if you are not scientifically prone, if you don't have a great understanding of science, I can see why you'd think that when you see, oh, well, we use AGCT to describe how this information weaves together. I can see why you'd think that, but that is false, and these people, they're relying on how much people they talk to don't know about these things. They want you to be ignorant because the more ignorant you are of how these things actually work, the more likely you are to believe their case. I've used this example, and I'll use it again too. Back in December, my mom, sister, and niece went to the Ark Encounter, which is run by the Creation Museum. And when they came back, my mom said, well, it was pretty convincing stuff. I mean, they had the scientific explanation, and they had their response to it. And yes, they do have the scientific explanation, their response to it. But their scientific explanation is often simplified, cherry-picked, and misrepresented. And then their explanation is, of course, a lot more in-depth and thorough, and more on point. They do this deliberately because they know that most people who go there aren't going to understand the science. So they're not going to have enough to know if what they're reading is really the scientific case. But they do have an understanding of religion. So, of course, the religious explanation sounds more likely. It's what they've been taught their whole lives, usually. And if you don't know, like, the scientific explanation, well, you don't know what you don't know. So yes, to a person who doesn't know that, it sounds very reasonable. To the rest of us, the scientific-minded, if we see this, we may say, well, actually, there's some problems with that description. This is cherry-picked, there's problems with it, and we can point them out. My mom can't say that. So, of course, she believes this one, the creationist one, which, of course, if you're scientific, you can say, well, I see a ton of problems with this. They rely on you not knowing things. You can't know what you don't know.
Scientist named Henry Quasler said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. In other words, our uniform and repeated experience affirms that there's...
On a side note, unrelated to any of this intelligent design creationist nonsense, you may notice occasionally that I drink stuff throughout my videos sometimes. You see, I'm a very thirsty person. I love nothing more than some good water or some good coffee. You may assume I have diabetes or something, which, fair enough, but I don't. But maybe we could make some kind of a meme out of this. Comment if you'd like to make a meme out of the drinking. Maybe make a drinking game out of the drinking. Remember, you gotta hydrate. When listening to complete bullshit, you gotta stay hydrated to maintain your intellectual awareness. And keep your mouth from getting dry when having to talk so much responding to these assholes.
There's only one type of cause that produces information. But uniform and repeated experience is the basis of all historical scientific reasoning. So there is a basis in historical scientific reasoning to infer intelligent design. There's no need or reason to limit.
There is not. There just isn't. And I've already explained why, so I'm not going to bother again. But there isn't. There just isn't. God, these people are so difficult to listen to, aren't they? Oh my God.
The conclusions that we can...
And also, before I forget, I wanted to point this out earlier but got distracted. Daily Dose of Wire posts these videos. They're react videos. They're supposed to be reaction videos, like what I do, basically. I react to people. But what does Daily Dose actually do? Well, sometimes he'll have an intro where he talks, and then, 10 plus minutes of just looking at the video happening in front of him. And no doubt he makes a lot of money from this. Good for him, I guess. But I think this is a very terrible way to go about it. Daily Dose of Wisdom, I know you're going to see one of these videos at some point, maybe even this one. If you see this video or other videos, I just want you to know, don't do this. Respond to the things you're hearing. Back them up or something. Don't just sit there going, do something. Do something. Say something. If you're going to do a react video, react to the video.
Consider in that branch of science, because
unless, and here's the bottom line for all of this,
unless, and here's the bottom line for all of this. The bottom line for all of this is that God exists, and God tells me that science is ready for him. It's ready for... Okay, my accent fell apart there. Yeah, I was trying something. It didn't work. I'm sorry, everybody. I apologize. Jordan Peterson, I could do much better. This sort of Irish accent, tough as hell, though.
Unless you presume a naturalistic worldview and imprison yourself within its confines.
That's the key issue.
That's not fair. If the evidence...
Doesn't the fact that scientists don't find, archaeologists don't find tablets, inscribed with language and go, that must be entirely natural. Doesn't the fact that they don't do that imply there's something wrong about your understanding of how it works? Because if your understanding is this one of hard materialism and naturalism, that's just completely beyond question that any agency could ever be involved, then they wouldn't think that humans were responsible for it, would they? They would think, well, this is just perfectly natural. The fact that they don't implies there's something wrong with your explanation, if not your understanding of how it works. Yes, we can infer design and agency. The fact that we don't in science concerning biology or cosmological stuff, that's a problem for your side. Because if archaeologists can do it and get away with it because they're right, then surely biologists could, or astronomers could, or physicists could, but they don't. They don't do that. Why not? Well, of course, to these people it's a big God-hating conspiracy. All scientists are atheists, and they hate God and don't want you to know the truth that God exists. But no, it's just because there is no God there. There are no turtles all the way down on this one. Sorry.
Evidence leads beyond a naturalistic view, you must pursue it, correct?
Why not? Why shouldn't you?
All right.
Yeah.
But why shouldn't you? That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're closing yourself
artificially-
within a prison.
All right.
Okay, now the next point that's made here deals with...
Finally, we get some words from Daily Dose of Wisdom. Finally, let's see what he does with this. I'm actually curious, and I hope you are too, because we've been waiting a long time for this guy to show up.
the systemic blinders that exist on many people, and it begins to point to an answer to that question. Why is this such a difficult chasm for people to cross intellectually, that when you see information you can infer that it comes from an intelligent source? Let's get into this now.
All three of you strike.
Okay, thanks for that total nothingness of a thought there, buddy. I mean, Jesus Christ, if you're gonna react properly. I feel like he just put that in there so he could say he said something, but he didn't really say anything, did he? Did anybody else notice that he didn't say anything?
Me as, well, of course, you're rather argumentative, but you all three of you strike me as rational men, and yet look at the lives you lead.
Well, I suspect this guy right here agrees with them. So, of course, they would strike him as rational. And honestly, let's be like fair to these people, okay? I am not saying these intelligent design creationist weirdos are entirely irrational. I'm sure they're perfectly rational people in a lot of senses. What I am saying is, when it comes to the issue of science, their religion, their religious perspectives are getting in the way of science. There are plenty of scientists out there that are religion. You have scientists that are Christian, that are Muslim, that are Jewish, that are Hindu, that are any number of other religions, indigenous and otherwise. They are out there. But what makes them good scientists is they don't let their religion get in the way of their science. They don't try to insert their religion into their science. Now, does it make the intelligent design creationist weirdos less rational because they do let their religion get in the way of their science. Not necessarily. However, it does make them, let's say, questionable in their rationality. I would question their rationality more because they're letting something get in the way. I'm sure they're perfectly rational people most of the time, but they are letting something get in there. I don't know if you can see the chapter title right here of like systemic blinders. You could say the intelligent design creationists have systemic blinders. They're blinded by a system of faith that gets in the way of their science. Otherwise, they would be perfectly rational people, most likely. I mean, they are qualified, as far as I'm aware. These people are qualified. They're just not doing it properly. They're not doing the science properly.
Steve Meyer wrote an article on the Cambrian explosion for the Proceedings of the Biological Society at the Smith.
Okay, before they go into the Cambrian explosion, as far as I'm aware, the Cambrian explosion wasn't really just a sudden emergence of just an otherworldly number of species. It may have been, and if it was, it would have been due to a changing climate finally enabling species to arise. In reality, it was probably something more like the Cambrian explosion is the first time that species evolved a number of like certain systems at once. Like, let's say bones. Bones are very important. Systems of bones emerged in the Cambrian explosion finally. It could be something like that. There are plenty of explanations for the Cambrian explosion that don't rely on, well, God obviously did that. There's no evidence for design in that process. There are many reasons that the Cambrian explosion could have arisen naturally, and I think God is obviously extremely unlikely. I mean, if you want explanations, it's like Jesus in the tomb thing. Let's say that Jesus really was crucified. I know we're going off topic here, but it's a good example. Let's say Jesus really was crucified. Let's say he was put in a tomb, or maybe he wasn't. But let's say he was put in a tomb, and people came to his tomb and the body was gone. What is the most likely explanation? The body was stolen by his followers or by somebody else, the Romans removed it themselves, or Jesus literally rose from the dead. Or actually, let's insert a wild one too. That Jesus wasn't actually dead and he recovered and walked out himself, or he rose from the dead. The least likely of those explanations is that he rose from the dead. And so with the Cambrian explosion, you could say, well, you could say that it was the sudden emergence of like the systems of bones. Finally, something that could be preserved properly. Or it was just the climate changed enough to allow evolution en masse. Or it was the first emergence of certain types of species that were more prone to be fossilized. Or God did it. Which one of those explanations is the least likely? Sure, you could say it's possible, but it's not very likely.
Smithsonian Institution, and his editor was harassed and finally left the institution. Michael Behe has evoked from his colleagues at Lehigh University, which is a great university and especially strong in the sciences, a statement on their website that Dr. Behe is entitled to express his views, but we, his colleagues in the biology department, do not view them as science.
He's been disclaimed.
He's been disclaimed.
Well, that's totally fair. Like, if you are making claims that you're doing something scientific and your scientific colleagues think you are wrong, they may still respect the other work you're doing. You can still do good work and believe in this garbage. You can. I'm sure maybe a lot of people do. But it's totally fair to say, well, we respect him for the good work he does, but this other work he's doing is just nonsense. You can say that. You're allowed to say that. There's nothing wrong with that.
Why? Academics espouse all kinds of crazy ideas. Why should the challenge to Darwin and the suggestion that if there's a code, there's a coder, the suggestion of an intelligent design, evoke such singular hostility? What?
Let's reduce this complexity a bit. Yes, people have a lot of weird ideas, a lot of weird scientific ideas. Intelligent design is not one of them. It's not scientific in any way. If we reduce this complexity down to its base form, the problem is that these people are trying to replace science with superstitious religious dogma. That is a problem. Let's use a very extreme example. Occasionally, at universities, there will be tenured professors who are Holocaust deniers. They may do good work in their field, but if they're a Holocaust denier, it's totally fair for their historical colleagues to say, well, we denounce this viewpoint. This viewpoint is wrong, it's offensive, it's bigoted. And you would expect them to. Now, this is not as serious as Holocaust denial, but it is a very serious thing because science is supposed to be about explaining things, and God did it is no explanation.
Is going on. I'll start with John because I didn't.
Also, I just want to clarify, that's not hostility. They were not saying he's a terrible person. They were not saying he needs to be denounced, that everybody should hate him and his work. They're just saying that he's not right about this, and we feel the need to issue a statement that he can't ride on the work this university does in order to prove his nonsense ideas. It's very different than just like straight up denounce. This is not a struggle session in Maoist China. This is people saying, we disagree with your take on this, my guy.
What is going on is the domination of naturalism and materialism in the academy, which is so ironical. I'm from Oxford University. Its motto, and it's been there for a long time, is Dominus Illuminatio Mea. The people that founded the great universities of the world had no problem with the idea of an intelligent designer of the.
Because they were Christians, they were creationists. They were often, universities were founded by the churches because the churches had like almost monopolistic control over the whole of society. That's why. I mean, there was no room for naturalistic sciences in the very beginning until the Reformation happened, until well into the Reformation, because at that point in time, or not the Reformation, sorry, the Renaissance, but I mean the Reformation played a part in disestablishing church from state, but the Renaissance was the point at which things really started to spin off in a more naturalistic direction. Until that point, the churches controlled everything. That's just how history works.
Universe. But now somehow, in the academy, anybody who espouses the idea that was the foundation of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries, arguably as a historical thesis, is out. That strikes.
You want to return to hundreds of years ago for your science. You can't do that. I'm sorry.
And that idea is, the founding idea is?
The founding idea is, well, let me quote C.S. Lewis. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the legislator. There it is, encapsulated. That's why.
And times have changed. Circumstances have changed. I mean, I have no doubt that in the very beginning they wanted to prove the existence of God using science, but instead, I'm sorry, my throat's having a big problem today. Instead, what happened was we found naturalistic explanations worked a lot better for everything we touched. That's how it ended up working, and since my voice is giving me some problems, I'm going to have to call it here, but we're not missing much. Let me assure you that by not doing the next 2 minutes or so of this video, we are not going to be missing much. My apologies for not finishing it, but you know, my throat is not working properly, so we're going to have to call it here, and I thank you for watching very much. I hope you learned something, or enjoyed it, or didn't enjoy it if you're one of these intelligent design creationist weirdos. I wish my throat were more intelligently designed so I could hold it together better and not have to cough and hack every few minutes. Thanks for that, designer. You did a great job there, and I hope you have a good one. Thanks for watching.